Recording in. All right, guys, we are going to be talking about the cell membrane and cell transport. All right, so all cells have a cell membrane made of proteins and lipids, right? We talked about phospholipids and we talked about channel proteins. So generally speaking, they're all made of proteins and lipids. The job of the cell membrane is to regulate or control the transport of molecules going into and out of the cell. The cell membrane is said to be selectively permeable, and that means that it's only going to let certain things in and out. It can't let everything in and everything out. It's going to control that, right? So for example, the cell wants to maintain water balance, right? It doesn't want to shrivel up and have too little inside of it, and it doesn't want to have too much water in its cytoplasm, which is that inner part of the cell right here. Okay, that's where that cytoplasm would be. And so it's going to send out water or bring in water to kind of keep that nice balance of water. I want to remind you that plant cells have that nice cell wall that surround the cell membrane that will prevent the cell from bursting. All right, we're going to highlight cytoplasm here just so that we know that we're worried about the water balance in the cytoplasm. The cell membrane is a barrier that protects from harm. I do want to remind you guys that it won't protect the cell from harm altogether, but it tries to protect it majority of the time. So for example, a virus, it can still get in sometimes. All right, and last but not least, we like to use these phrases here, that it secretes waste and it brings in nutrients and oxygen. And I want to remind you that waste isn't always something toxic. CO2, for example, is a waste. All right, and this is important that small molecules can slide right through that membrane, but bigger molecules may need a protein channel. So let's talk a little bit more about cell transport specifically, right? So obviously our goal of cell transport is to get molecules into the cell, like oxygen, and to get waste molecules out of the cell, for example, CO2, right? We don't want too much CO2 because that can mean that our blood gets too acidic. That's not good. So we have two big categories. We have passive transport and active transport. Okay, and so passive transport, no energy is needed, and the molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until it hits equal concentration on both sides. And remember, concentration just means amount. So if we look at this picture right here, okay, there are more molecules inside the cell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? So that's the area of high concentration. And those molecules are going to move to an area of low concentration, which is outside. There's only 3, right? If you need help with this, rewatch those animations so you can kind of see that on video. Active transport is something that we haven't really talked about that before. And so it's going to be just the opposite. Active transport, right? I like to think of active as being like ATP. Okay, so meaning it needs energy. And it's when they're going to move from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, which is against the concentration gradient, meaning that this is going to require energy. And so if we look here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and inside is that high concentration. And look at the arrow, right? The molecules are moving from an area of low concentration to high. And that's just means that's because it needs energy because it's not something that naturally happens. Naturally, the molecules want to go from high to low. And when you're pushing them against where they want to go, you're going to need energy to do that. We notice here that we have some nice ATP there to show us that this is requiring energy. Remember that size of molecules is super important, right? Sorry about that. Some molecules are too big to fit through the cell membrane. For example, starch, fats, proteins, they all need to be digested first in order to pass through the cell membrane. But molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water are already small enough, right? So let's go through some specific examples of diffusion um, in the body and in organisms. Okay, so we just want to remind ourselves, diffusion, no energy and molecules move from high to low. So if we look at this nice picture right here, okay, it kind of shows us that through time, molecules are going to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration until they hit equal. So see how these molecules here are at a high concentration and this is low? That means that they're going to move this way. So I'm going to put a nice arrow here. You guys can do that too. I'm going to put an arrow. And then remember that we have that equilibrium. They're going to move until they're equal on both sides. This is at equilibrium right here. All right, so remember, no energy needed because these are where molecules want to move and they'll naturally do that. So here's some examples. The biggest example of diffusion that we've actually talked about is in the lungs and at the cellular level, gas exchange, right? So gas exchange in the alveoli and the cell. Okay, when red blood cells come to the lungs, they're very low on oxygen because they gave that oxygen away. And so the alveoli, because you breathed in, is super, super high in oxygen. So what you're going to see is that that oxygen just immediately diffuses right to the red blood cells from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And that happens without energy. Same thing at the with CO2, if you think about it. Cells that come to the lungs came from the body. So they have a very high amount of carbon dioxide. And in the alveoli, where you just breathed in, you're going to have a low amount of carbon dioxide. So all that carbon dioxide will leave your cell, go right to the alveoli to be breathed out, and that's diffusion. Okay, so gas exchange is a huge example of diffusion in the body. Another example is when we think about plants and nutrients coming from the soil. So if we look at this picture, right, we're going to have a high level of nutrients or a high concentration of nutrients in the soil, okay? Low in, this is an onion. We're talking about nutrients, right? The concentration is going to be higher in the soil, lower in the onion. And so those nutrients will actually just naturally diffuse right into that onion, which is pretty cool. And so plant roots use diffusion to get nutrients and water into themselves, right? And that's just a natural process because nutrients go from a high concentration to a low concentration. So they'll be absorbed into that plant. Now let's talk about something called facilitated diffusion. We haven't used this word before, but it's very simple. It's just diffusion, except we need a protein channel, right? So sometimes molecules just need a protein channel to be able to get in. And so this is still diffusion. Okay, so I kind of put this up here, no energy, high to low protein channel. Okay, so same thing as diffusion, no energy, high concentration to low concentration, there's just a protein channel here. So the biggest example that we've talked about before is glucose, right? We talked about glucose gates, right? And so glucose can't just kind of slip through the membrane, right? And what I mean by that is here, they can't just kind of slide through here. They have to go through this nice protein channel here, which is the glucose gates that we were talking about. Still diffusion, still high to low, no energy is needed, but glucose just needs that protein channel to get in. So let's talk about some examples of active transport. So remember, this is needs ATP. I like to think of that active as needing energy, and it's going to go from a low to a high. All right. And so some examples in the body. Let's go ahead and look at this right here. So I know this is a little confusing, but we're going to look at sodium first. And so let's see, sodium is the orange. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on this side in the extracellular space. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4 down here. So obviously that's sodium by this arrow, that sodium's going from a low concentration to a high concentration. I'm sorry, it's showing it right here. I apologize. Right there. See that little sodium kind of going upwards towards the high concentration? And so that one is going to be ATP. We also, or active transport. And we also see that there's ATP right there, which gives a dead giveaway that this is active transport. And so when is this needed in the body? So we have something called calcium ions in cardiac muscle cells. They actually need to use active transport. Something called sodium potassium pumps. Those are also going to use active transport. Typically, if you see sodium, which is Na+, it's typically going to be talking about active transport. And then, interestingly enough, when the cell is secreting proteins like enzymes, hormones, and antibodies, that is actually active transport. So we're going to just take a look at that so that we know what that looks like. And so if we look here, let's see. So this here is going to be like that protein, like an enzyme. And so when we're moving it, in this instance, if we're moving it from an area of low to high, that's active transport. So let's look right here. Okay. Now, if this little square was like maybe a little protein or maybe a little antibody, if you look inside the cell, which is right here, there's an area of low concentration. So there's only one of them, right? And then here's that high concentration. So do you see how that's active transport, where we're kind of pushing it from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration on the outside? So this is going to require energy from the cell to put forth. Okay, so we're actually going to put in here ATP. We're going to say low to high. I'm going to put a nice little arrow so that we know that that's active transport. Last thing, cell communication, which we talked about. Okay, the cell membrane has a important role of cell communication. And so that is recognition of chemical signals, right? And so cell membranes have cell receptors that receive messages. So cell signaling molecules, and these could be hormones, they could be neurotransmitters, must fit the shape of the receptor. So if you remember when we talked about like insulin, right? Insulin is a hormone and it has to fit the shape of the insulin receptor perfect. Otherwise, the cell will never receive the message and it'll never bind, which is an issue, right? For example, diabetes. If insulin cannot bind, then it can't open the glucose gates, and that causes a really big issue. We also like to talk about this as recognition of chemical signals too. So if you see that word or that phrase, it's talking about cell communication. Last but not least, these are just some tips for answering some cell transport questions. If you're getting a question and it's asking what way do they move? Do they move through diffusion or active transport? Here are some tips. The first thing you're going to want to do is identify the movement of molecules. So count, right? And see, are they moving from an area of low to high or high to low? If it's low to high, it has to be active transport. If it's high to low, it's diffusion. Next, always look to see if there's ATP in the picture. If there's ATP in the picture, it is a dead giveaway that it's active transport. But it's not always, they don't always show the ATP, which is the issue. So don't rely on that. So sometimes it'll be active transport, but they just don't show the ATP. So just be mindful of that. And then misconception. I want to make sure we understand that molecules will move until they're equal on both sides. And once they're equal, they're no longer really going to move around a lot. Okay, so they don't all shift from one side to the next side. They're all going to move until they hit equilibrium. All right. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, make sure you reach out and let us know.